You've heard the name. You've seen him on Mount Rushmore. But most people have no idea just how insane the life of Theodore Roosevelt really was. This is a man who gave a 90-minute speech after being shot in the chest, who chased boat thieves through the frozen Badlands with a copy of Anna Karenina, who boxed blind in the White House, rode moose through rivers, and nearly died in the Amazon trying to chart a river so dangerous even locals avoided it. He wasn't just a president. He was a force of nature. And once you hear the whole story, you'll understand why he's the most larger-than-life figure in American history. A man so fearless, so relentless, and so absolutely unhinged that history barely kept up with him. And it all begins on the worst day of his life. Theodore Roosevelt wasn't born a legend. He was born weak, a frail, sickly child gasping for air between violent asthma attacks. Little T.D. Roosevelt didn't look like someone destined to be carved into a mountain. Doctors warned him, avoid physical strain, or it might kill you. But Roosevelt's father, a towering figure in his life, gave him different advice. You have the mind, he said, but you haven't got the body. You must make your body. And so he did. Roosevelt launched himself into a brutal physical training routine. Boxing, weightlifting, hiking, gymnastics. Anything that would harden his body to match his iron will. He wasn't trying to win medals. He was trying to survive. To prove to himself and the world that no illness could break him. He wasn't just getting stronger. He was becoming unstoppable. But physical strength wasn't the only obsession taking hold. Roosevelt was already showing signs of a wild, obsessive curiosity. As a kid, he wandered into a New York market, found a severed seal head lying in the gutter, and took it home. Not as a trophy, but as a specimen. He studied it, skinned it, stuffed it, and added it to his growing collection of dead birds and animals, all meticulously preserved by the boy himself in his homemade Roosevelt Museum of Natural History. And yes, he carried arsenic in his travel bags for taxidermy. He kept this streak of intensity through Harvard, where he juggled academics with boxing and rowing, sometimes shouting down professors and hammering his palm for emphasis during debates. He wasn't just eccentric. He was burning with a relentless need to grow, to do, to be more. Every day, no breaks. But all that energy would be tested in the most brutal way imaginable. February 14th, 1884. Valentine's Day. For most people, a day of flowers and love. For Theodore Roosevelt, it became a day of death. That morning, his beloved mother, Mittie, died suddenly of typhoid fever. He barely had time to process the loss when, just hours later, his 22-year-old wife, Alice, died in the same house. 2 floors above. Her kidneys had failed just days after giving birth to their first child. His mother, his wife, both gone. On the same day, in the same home. In his journal, he didn't write a page, just a big black X and 7 words beneath it. The light has gone out of my life. And then, he disappeared. Roosevelt didn't just mourn, he fled. He left his infant daughter with his sister and vanished into the wilderness of the Dakota Badlands, land so unforgiving even seasoned cowboys hesitated. But Roosevelt wasn't just looking for isolation. He was chasing punishment and purpose. He bought 2 cattle ranches, rode hundreds of miles, braved blizzards, hunted grizzly bears, broke wild horses, and, because this is Roosevelt, chased down armed boat thieves across a frozen river with a Winchester rifle in one hand and Anna Karenina in the other. Let that sink in. 3 armed outlaws had stolen his boat. Roosevelt tracked them for days through icy wilderness, captured them at gunpoint, then personally escorted them 40 hours back through cactus country, forcing them to march barefoot so they couldn't escape. And to stay awake, he read Tolstoy. The man who had once been a fragile, grieving aristocrat now slept in freezing cabins, punched out cowboys in bar fights, and stared down death on a near-daily basis. It was there, under a sky filled with howling wind and cattle skulls, that Roosevelt buried the old version of himself. And when he came back east, the world didn't recognize him. He had scars now, a rough voice, a wild glint in his eye. He didn't come back healed, he came back forged. As he later said, "If it had not been for the West, I never would have been president. When Roosevelt returned from the Badlands, he didn't ease back into politics. He kicked the door down. In 1895, he became New York City's police commissioner, a job most people treated like a political graveyard. But Roosevelt wasn't most people. The NYPD was riddled with corruption, bribes, favoritism, backroom deals, all business as usual. Until Roosevelt showed up with a fire in his chest and no patience for excuses. He fired the police chief, installed merit-based promotions, and, in true Roosevelt fashion, didn't just sit in an office. He disguised himself and roamed the streets at night, walking through snow and shadows to catch officers who had abandoned their posts. These midnight rambles made him feared by every lazy cop in the city. He banned drinking in saloons on Sundays, a wildly unpopular move that earned him death threats and 2 letter bombs. Roosevelt didn't flinch. Because for him, this wasn't politics, this was war. Roosevelt's next move took him to Washington, where he was appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1897. Most men in that role sat behind desks. Roosevelt started planning global domination. He believed America needed a world-class Navy, and he wasn't shy about it. He wrote reports, reorganized fleets, and made sure the Navy was locked, loaded, and ready, especially after the mysterious explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor. While the government hesitated, Roosevelt acted. He prepped ships, issued orders, and when war with Spain finally broke out in 1898, he didn't wait for permission. He resigned. Why? Because Roosevelt didn't just want to plan a war, he wanted to fight one. Roosevelt formed a volunteer cavalry known as the Rough Riders, a unit so absurd it sounds made up. Ivy League athletes, Texas cowboys, Native American scouts, ex-convicts, sheriffs, a boxer named Kid, and a hunter who shot with both hands. And leading them? A nearsighted intellectual with a mustache and a thirst for chaos. In the scorching heat of Cuba, the Rough Riders charged into the Battle of San Juan Hill. It was brutal. Chaos. Gunfire everywhere. The kind of battle where most men hide behind cover and pray. Roosevelt charged. Not from the rear, from the front. When his horse was shot out from under him, he ran forward on foot, bullets flying. His coat was shredded by gunfire. His glasses were smashed. Shrapnel tore through his arm. He didn't stop. He didn't even blink. It wasn't a planned maneuver. No one ordered it. Roosevelt simply decided that the hill needed to be taken, and he was going to take it. That reckless charge didn't just win a battle. It made him a national hero overnight. And to a war-weary nation, Roosevelt wasn't just a brave man. He was the kind of fearless, feral leader Americans didn't know they needed. When President William McKinley was assassinated in 1901, the country didn't just get a new leader, it got a storm. At just 42 years old, Theodore Roosevelt became the youngest president in American history, and within weeks, he made it clear he wasn't there to sit quietly behind a desk. He came in swinging. At the turn of the century, monopolies ruled everything. Railroads, oil, beef, steel. Prices were rigged, workers were crushed, and the rich got richer. Roosevelt didn't care who you were. Railroad baron, oil tycoon, Wall Street shark. If you tried to control the country, he came for your throat. They called him a trust buster. He filed lawsuits, tore apart corporate empires, and made the Sherman Antitrust Act actually mean something. When J.P. Morgan, the most powerful banker in the world, tried to pull strings behind the scenes, Roosevelt stared him down like a wolf in a cage. No one had ever seen a president like this. He wasn't afraid of the elite. He hunted them. But for all his courtroom battles and political warfare, Roosevelt's true love was nature. In 1903, he took a legendary camping trip with naturalist John Muir. Not a photo op, not a press stunt, an actual wilderness trek through Yosemite. They slept under the stars, hiked through Glacier Point, and stood on mountain peaks with nothing but wind and pine needles for company. Roosevelt would later call it the grandest day of my life. That trip changed him, and it changed America. He returned to Washington and rewrote the future of the country's wild places. Over the course of his presidency, Roosevelt protected 230 million acres of land. That's more than the entire state of Texas. He created 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, 150 national forests, and launched the U.S. Forest Service. He wasn't just preserving land. He was building an empire of wilderness for generations he'd never meet. In 1906, Roosevelt did something no other president had ever done. He ended a war and won the Nobel Peace Prize for it. 2 world powers, Russia and Japan, were locked in brutal conflict. Roosevelt didn't just offer to mediate. He forced them to the table. He negotiated the Treaty of Portsmouth, and it worked. The war ended. He was a president with the heart of a fighter and the mind of a tactician. A man who could charge up a hill with bullets flying, then sit at a table and end a global conflict with a pen. In 1906, Roosevelt also became the first sitting U.S. president to leave the country, sailing to Panama to inspect the massive canal project he had backed with everything he had. The Panama Canal was a feat of impossible ambition, a waterway slicing through the continent to connect the Atlantic and Pacific. Men were dying of disease, equipment was failing, and morale was sinking. Roosevelt showed up in person, in the mud, shaking hands with the workers and rallying them like a battlefield general. Because for him, this wasn't just engineering, it was destiny. And he wasn't done. To prove that the United States had arrived on the world stage, Roosevelt launched the Great White Fleet, 16 gleaming steel battleships that circled the globe from 1907 to 1909. It wasn't just a parade, it was a message. To Europe, to Asia, to every port they entered. The age of American power had begun. And Roosevelt didn't do it quietly. He did it with cannons, coal smoke, and an iron smile that told the world, the United States is here, and we're not backing down. While other presidents tried to maintain dignity and tradition, Roosevelt turned the White House into a circus, literally. We're talking about a home filled with a blue parrot named Eli Yale, a hyena, flying squirrels, snakes, lizards, miniature ponies, a one-legged rooster, and yes, a badger named Josiah who was known to bite people's ankles on command. One of his pets was a full-grown bear named Jonathan Edwards, which he reportedly wrestled for fun. But that wasn't even the craziest part. His daughter Alice Roosevelt was a firestorm all her own. Nicknamed Princess Alice by the press and the Wild Child by Roosevelt himself, she once walked into a party with a live boa constrictor wrapped around her neck. She'd smoke cigarettes on the White House roof, drive recklessly through D.C., and release pet snakes during official dinners, just to watch ambassadors squirm. When asked why he didn't rein her in, Roosevelt famously replied, "I can either run the country or I can attend to Alice, but I cannot possibly do both." Roosevelt didn't just fight political battles. He literally boxed inside the White House. At nearly 50 years old, he'd still lace up gloves and challenge friends, soldiers, even foreign diplomats to step into the ring with him in the White House gym. And he didn't pull punches. During one of these impromptu matches, a young artillery officer landed a brutal hit that detached Roosevelt's retina, leaving him permanently blind in his left eye. Did that stop him? Not a chance. Roosevelt just switched from boxing to jiu-jitsu and became the first American president to earn a brown belt. He even invited Japanese judo masters to train him in the East Room. Because for Roosevelt, slowing down wasn't an option. It was a personal insult. When Roosevelt wasn't wrangling animals or sparring in the gym, he was skinny dipping. Yes, the President of the United States would often strip naked and leap into the freezing Potomac River, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends, and occasionally with foreign soldiers or diplomats, daring them to keep up. But for all his chaos and energy, Roosevelt had a mind like a steel trap. He read 1 to 3 books per day, in English, French, German, or Latin, didn't matter. And not only did he remember everything he read, he had a habit of ripping out each page once he finished it, tossing it aside like he was devouring the book itself. He once gave a speech on Greek military history entirely from memory, no notes. He wrote over 35 books in his lifetime, published 150,000 letters, and could quote poetry from decades earlier without missing a syllable. Roosevelt had no time for fluff. When the official White House portrait artist unveiled his work, Roosevelt hated it so much that he burned it in a fireplace, calling it a mewing cat. He didn't want to be remembered as meek. He wanted to be remembered as thunder in a suit. And fueling that thunder? Coffee. By the gallon. Roosevelt drank it constantly, with 7 lumps of sugar in each cup, sometimes more. One observer joked that the coffee was really just a vehicle for his sugar addiction. It wasn't healthy. It wasn't normal. But that was the point. Roosevelt didn't want to be normal. He wanted to burn bright, a human hurricane, tearing through life with unstoppable force. And that's exactly what he did. By 1912, Roosevelt had already been president, war hero, cowboy, sheriff, and explorer. But instead of settling into quiet retirement, he pulled a classic Roosevelt move. He decided to run again. This time, not with the Republicans. He broke away to form his own party, the Progressive Party, better known as the Bull Moose Party. Why Bull Moose? Because when asked if he felt healthy enough to campaign, Roosevelt growled, "I'm as strong as a bull moose." But on October 14, 1912, that nickname would be put to the ultimate test. Roosevelt was in Milwaukee, about to give a speech to a packed theater. As he stepped into an open car, a man emerged from the crowd. John Schrank, a deranged bartender from New York. Without a word, Schrank pulled a pistol and fired a single shot straight into Roosevelt's chest. The crowd screamed. His aides rushed to him. Blood soaked through his shirt. Everyone assumed he was dying. But Roosevelt didn't fall. He stayed on his feet. And then, in the most Roosevelt move imaginable, he reached into his coat and pulled out the bullet-pierced manuscript of his speech. 50 pages thick, folded in half, the dense bundle, along with his steel eyeglass case, had slowed the bullet just enough to save his life. It had lodged in his chest muscle, inches from his heart. The doctor traveling with him begged him to go to the hospital. Roosevelt refused. He looked out at the horrified crowd and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." And then, with blood leaking through his clothes, he gave the entire 90-minute speech. No flinching, no stalling. Just a man with a bullet in his chest, refusing to back down. Doctors later said removing the slug would be more dangerous than leaving it in. So the bullet stayed, in his body, for the rest of his life. That wasn't politics. That was mythology. And Roosevelt had just become something more than a man. He had become the living embodiment of American toughness. You'd think after losing the 1912 election, most men would quietly fade into retirement. Not Theodore Roosevelt. Instead, at 54 years old, he signed up for what would become the most dangerous journey of his life. He set his sights on an uncharted, snake-infested, disease-ridden tributary of the Amazon called the River of Doubt. This was no publicity stunt, no cameras, no applause. This was a real-life descent into the jungle, with death waiting at every bend. The expedition turned into a nightmare. Treacherous rapids smashed their canoes. Supplies ran out. One man drowned, another was murdered. Roosevelt gashed his leg on a rock and developed a tropical infection so severe he couldn't walk. His fever spiked. He became delirious, hallucinating, weak, ready to die. He told his son Kermit, "Leave me behind, save yourself." But Kermit refused. Dragging his father through the jungle, Kermit kept him alive, and after months of suffering, they stumbled out of the rainforest, barely alive. Roosevelt had lost over 50 pounds, and he never fully recovered. But the river he conquered? It now bears his name, the Roosevelt River. Even after that, the man just kept going. In 1910, he became the first former U.S. president to fly in an airplane. He also dove beneath the waves in the Navy's early submarines, just to test them out himself. On a transatlantic voyage in 1914, he shared stories with Harry Houdini, trading tales of survival and illusion. But not all his legacy came from bullets or battles. In 1902, on a hunting trip, Roosevelt was offered an easy shot at a bear, one that had been tied to a tree. He refused. He said it wasn't sporting, and he walked away. That moment inspired a political cartoon, which inspired a toy maker. And just like that, the teddy bear was born. Millions of children still hold one today, all because Roosevelt had the integrity to say no. He also changed the course of sports history. At the time, college football was killing people, literally. Over a dozen deaths had been reported in a single season. So Roosevelt stepped in. He summoned the heads of major universities and demanded rule changes. What followed was the invention of the forward pass, legal blocks, and standardized helmets, saving the sport from extinction. Today, football owes its very existence to Roosevelt's intervention. When it was finally time to rest, he left behind a legacy unlike anything America had seen. He had explored uncharted jungles, charged up battlefields, taken bullets for his beliefs, crushed monopolies, protected 230 million acres of wild land, built the Panama Canal, won the Nobel Peace Prize, and rewrote the definition of what it meant to be a leader. He once said, "Get action, do things, be sane, don't fritter away your time, create, act, take a place wherever you are, and be somebody. Get action." And that's exactly what he did. Roosevelt didn't just live a big life. He lived a life too big for the world he was born into. He wasn't just president. He was the bull moose, the storm, the myth, the man who made history bend around him. Theodore Roosevelt was larger-than-life history.